Focusing the lens on the unseen and crossing the lines of traditional history, we reveal what truly happened. Experience an in-depth look at the precise moments that shifted our reality completely.
I'm going to be honest with you, we don't usually see your kind carrying this kind of money around here.
I withdrew it from the bank 4 blocks down. The receipt
That's
is in
the
the
thing.
envelope.
Banks don't usually let people like you walk out with this kind of cash without somebody flagging it. So
Well,
I'm just saying, this neighborhood, this amount of money, somebody who looks like you moving fast on a bike, it doesn't exactly happen.
Officers Craig Beckett and Dave Casper had spent 6 years patrolling Decatur County like it was their personal property, stopping who they wanted, searching who they pleased, and answering to nobody. 6 years of pulling over black men on pretextual stops and sending them on their way with nothing to show for it but humiliation. Because humiliation left no paper trail and filed no complaints that anyone in the department felt any urgency to act on. 6 years of working a stretch of road they had quietly claimed as their own, where their word was the only word that mattered, where their instincts were never questioned, and where the particular kind of authority they exercised. Casual, unhurried, and entirely without accountability, had calcified over time into something that felt to both of them indistinguishable from the truth. They had never once been formally disciplined. They had never once sat across from a superior officer and been asked to explain themselves in any way that carried real consequences. They had filed reports, ticked boxes, moved on, and that absence of consequences had made them bold in the particular way that unchecked men become bold, not louder, not more aggressive on the surface, just more certain. More certain that they could read a situation in under 10 seconds. More certain that their first impression was the correct one. More certain that the law as they understood and applied it on Riverside Corridor was whatever they decided it was on any given afternoon. The afternoon they pulled over a black man on a motorbike carrying a bag of cash on Riverside Corridor, they didn't see a homeowner on his way back from the bank. They saw a criminal who needed to be taken apart slowly and carefully until the evidence caught up with what they already knew. They pulled him over on a public road in broad afternoon light, surrounded him before he had finished cutting the engine, searched his belongings without consent, accused him to his face with the calm confidence of men who had never once been made to answer for what they did on that road, and told him he was not leaving until he had explained every single dollar in that bag to their satisfaction. What officers Beckett and Casper didn't know, what they would have known immediately, had either of them done their job with even a fraction of the care they spent constructing, their assumptions was that the man standing in front of them had survived 2 combat tours in the United States Marine Corps, held a commendation for valor signed by his commanding general, and had just become, in the space of one poorly judged afternoon stop on Riverside Corridor, the single most expensive mistake either of them would ever make in their entire lives. Before we go any further, what city or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments right now. We love seeing where our JPTV family is tuning in from all around the world. And if you believe that a man who bled for this country deserves more respect on his own street than what these 2 officers gave him that afternoon, hit that like button and subscribe to JPTV, because justice doesn't prevail in silence. Now let's get into it. Riverside Corridor runs through the heart of Decatur County like a seam holding 2 halves of a working city together. It is not a glamorous road, and it does not pretend to be. On the east side, you have the older residential blocks. Wide driveways, mature oak trees whose roots have spent decades pushing slowly through the pavement beside them. Houses that have been in the same families long enough to have seen children grow up and come back with children of their own. The lawns on the east side are not manicured in the way that suggests professional maintenance. They are kept the way people keep things they genuinely own. Mowed when they need mowing, repaired when something breaks, looked after with the steady, unpretentious attention of people who have decided to stay somewhere and mean it. On the west side, you have the commercial stretch, a pharmacy with a hand-painted sign that has been the same since 1994, a hardware store that stocks things you cannot find online, a branch of Caldwell Community Bank sitting between a barber shop that opens at 7 in the morning and a sandwich place that has operated out of the same narrow building since 1987 and has never once felt the need to update its exterior. It is the kind of road that does not appear on anyone's list of notable places, but holds a neighborhood together in the way that only ordinary roads can. by being there every day, reliable and unchanged, while everything around it shifts. Jerome Calloway was 41 years old and had lived on the east side of Riverside Corridor for the past 7 years, in a 3-bedroom house on Dunbar Crescent that he had purchased with his separation pay when he left the Marine Corps, and had been rebuilding, room by room, with his own hands ever since. He was broad across the shoulders in the way that men are broad when the width comes from actual use rather than the gym, and he moved with the unhurried, deliberate economy of someone who had learned a long time ago that speed and urgency were not the same thing, and that most situations responded better to the former than the latter. He had enlisted at 19 years old, the second of 3 sons in a household in East Point, Georgia, where the expectation had always been that you found something worth doing and committed to it fully. The Marine Corps had been his something. He had served 2 full tours, the first in Iraq between 2004 and 2005, the second in Afghanistan between 2008 and 2009, and had come home from the second with a commendation for valor, a bad left knee that stiffened in cold weather, and had never fully resolved despite 2 rounds of physical therapy and a clear-eyed, unhurried relationship with difficulty that only comes from having faced the kind of difficulty that most people only read about. He did not talk about his service often. He did not wear it as an identity. It was simply something he had done, something that had shaped the way he thought and moved and made decisions, and something that sat quietly inside him the way important things do when a person has made peace with them. In the years since leaving the Corps, he had built something deliberate and solid. He worked as a site supervisor for Hargrove Construction, a mid-sized firm that operated across 3 counties, and trusted Jerome with the kind of projects that required someone who could hold a schedule, manage a crew, and solve problems in real time without needing to escalate every decision upward. He coached youth football on Saturday mornings at Decatur Community Park, working with boys between the ages of 10 and 14, most of whom needed someone to show up consistently more than they needed anything else. And he spent the remainder of his time on the house on Dunbar Crescent, which had become, over the years, something closer to a long-term conversation with himself than a renovation project. Each room finished a considered statement about what he was building and why. That Tuesday, the house needed the next phase of that conversation to begin. The kitchen and the main bathroom had been on the plan for over a year, delayed twice by scheduling conflicts and once by a materials backlog, and the contractor Jerome had hired to handle the work. A straight-talking, reliable tradesman named Weston Briggs, whom Jerome had used on 2 previous jobs and trusted completely, was due to begin the following Monday. Weston worked cash only. He had stated this plainly and without apology the first time they met, explaining that it kept his bookkeeping simple and his scheduling clean, and Jerome had never had any issue with it. He had called Caldwell Community Bank the previous evening to arrange the withdrawal, confirmed the amount with the branch manager, and driven his motorbike the 4 blocks down Riverside Corridor that afternoon to collect it. The transaction was straightforward and quick. The teller, a woman named Patricia who had processed Jerome's transactions for the better part of 3 years and greeted him by name, counted the bills twice, sealed them in a bank envelope, clipped the receipt to the outside with a small binder clip, and slid it across the counter. Jerome tucked the envelope into the inner zip pocket of his riding jacket, zipped it closed, thanked Patricia, and walked back out through the glass doors of Caldwell Community Bank into the flat, bright afternoon light of Riverside Corridor. He pulled on his helmet in the parking lot, started the motorbike, and pulled out onto the road heading east toward Dunbar Crescent. He was 4 minutes from home. He had a call scheduled with Weston at 6 to confirm the Monday start time. Vivian had mentioned that morning that she was making jollof rice for dinner, which meant the house would smell extraordinary by the time he got back. And that was the full extent of what Jerome Calloway was thinking about as he rode east on Riverside Corridor at 2:47 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in October. He had covered perhaps 3 of the 4 minutes when the patrol car pulled out from the side street beside the hardware store and the lights came on behind him. Craig Beckett was driving. Dave Casper was in the passenger seat with his right arm resting across the open window frame, watching the road with the loose, half-attentive expression of a man who had been doing the same job on the same stretch of road for long enough that nothing surprised him anymore. Or so he believed. Beckett saw the motorbike first, saw the rider. noted the jacket sitting slightly heavy on one side in the way a jacket sits when something substantial is in the inner pocket. He did not consider that the weight might be a phone or a wallet or a perfectly legal bank envelope containing money that belonged entirely and unambiguously to the man wearing the jacket. He reached for the lights. Casper straightened up in his seat. Jerome heard the siren blip once behind him and felt something settle in his chest. Not fear, not panic, but the cold and specific recognition of a man who understood immediately what kind of stop this was going to be. He indicated, moved to the shoulder of Riverside Corridor, and cut the engine. He placed both hands on the handlebars, kept them visible, and waited. Beckett and Casper stepped out of the patrol car at the same time. Jerome didn't move from his bike. He kept both hands visible on the handlebars and waited while Beckett and Casper approached from either side. A two-sided approach that had nothing to do with standard procedure and everything to do with pressure. The kind of positioning designed to make a person feel surrounded and outnumbered before a single word had been exchanged. Jerome recognized it for what it was. He had used similar positioning himself in different circumstances, on different terrain, for different reasons. And those reasons had never included making an innocent person feel small on the shoulder of a public road. Beckett reached him first. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask if everything was all right or whether Jerome needed assistance. He looked at Jerome, then at the jacket, then back at Jerome and said, "What are you carrying?" Jerome answered him directly and without hesitation. He told Beckett that he had just come from Caldwell Community Bank on Riverside Corridor, that he had made a scheduled cash withdrawal for a home renovation contractor starting the following Monday, and that the money was sealed in a bank envelope in his inner jacket pocket, along with the printed receipt. He said he was happy to show them and reached slowly into the pocket, keeping his movements visible and deliberate the way his training had taught him and the way his life in this country had reinforced. Beckett took the envelope. He looked at it for a moment. At the Caldwell Community Bank logo printed on the front, at the receipt clipped neatly to the outside with the time, amount, and teller window number printed clearly across the top. And then he passed it sideways to Casper without saying anything. Casper turned it over in his hands the way someone handles an object they have already categorized as suspicious and are simply working backward from that conclusion to find the language to justify it. "That's a lot of cash," Casper said. His voice carried the easy, unhurried weight of a man who was not asking a question, but making a statement designed to function as one. "It's for a contractor," Jerome said. "He works cash only. The receipt shows the time and the amount. I made the withdrawal 40 minutes ago." Casper looked at the receipt. Then he handed the envelope back to Beckett without commenting on what the receipt said. Beckett held it for another moment and then looked at Jerome and said, "Step off the bike, please." Jerome stepped off the bike. What happened next was not a conversation, and it was not a search conducted within any reasonable interpretation of procedure. It was an inspection. Slow, deliberate, and performative, carried out by two men who had already reached their conclusion and were now constructing the appearance of due diligence around it. Beckett went through the jacket pockets one by one, unhurried, thorough, while Casper moved around the motorbike in a slow circle, crouching at intervals to look at the frame, the storage compartment, the underside of the seat. Jerome stood on the shoulder of Riverside Corridor with his arms slightly out from his sides and watched them go through his belongings on a public road in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. A pickup truck slowed as it passed. A woman coming out of the pharmacy across the street paused on the pavement and looked over. Neither of them stopped. Neither of them said anything. Beckett found nothing in the jacket. He found nothing on the bike. He found nothing anywhere because there was nothing to find, and Jerome told him this plainly. That the envelope, the receipt, his phone, and his keys were the complete inventory of what he was carrying, that all of it was exactly what he had said it was, and that the bank was 4 blocks behind them if either of them wanted to walk in and confirm the transaction with the branch directly. Beckett looked at him for a moment. Then he took the envelope and the receipt back to the patrol car. He was calling banks. Casper stayed on the roadside with Jerome while Beckett worked through a list of branches, checking every bank within a 10-mile radius of Riverside Corridor for reported robberies, suspicious activity alerts, or any incident flagged in the past 2 hours that could be connected to a large cash withdrawal. Jerome stood quietly and waited. He counted the minutes the way he had learned to count time in circumstances where patience was not optional. Steadily, without drama, simply marking the passage of it. 18 minutes passed. Every call came back clean. No robberies, no alerts, no flags of any kind at any branch in the area. The afternoon was entirely clear. Beckett got out of the car and walked back. Jerome looked at him steadily and said, "Are we done?" Beckett said, "Not yet." Those two words settled over the stop like a door closing. The evidence was gone. Every justification Beckett had reached for had come back empty. The search had found nothing. The bank calls had found nothing. The receipt in his hand said exactly what Jerome had told him it would say from the very beginning. But Beckett said not yet, and Casper said nothing to contradict him, because the stop had never actually been about the money or the bike or the receipt or the banks. The money had simply been the first available excuse. The thing that gave the stop a surface that could be written into a report if it needed to be. What the stop was actually about was something neither of them would ever say out loud. Something that had operated as a quiet, unexamined certainty in both of them since the moment Beckett's eyes found Jerome on Riverside Corridor and made a decision in under 4 seconds that 11 years of procedure and 6 years of partnership had never once taught either of them to question. Casper started asking questions that had nothing to do with the withdrawal or the envelope or the contractor or anything Jerome had already addressed. How long had he lived in Decatur County? Where exactly on Dunbar Crescent? Did he own the property or was he renting? How long had he had the motorbike? Whether the motorbike was fully paid off or still under a financing agreement. Jerome answered every question. He answered them in the same level, unhurried tone he had used from the beginning, giving complete and accurate information each time, because he understood that the record of this stop, whatever record existed, was going to matter later, and he intended to make sure that his part of it was clean and consistent and impossible to challenge. He was a man who had operated in environments where the details were the difference between outcomes, and he treated this sidewalk the same way. When he mentioned, without making a production of it, that he had served in the United States Marine Corps. 2 tours, honorable discharge. Casper glanced at Beckett with an expression that was brief and unguarded enough to be genuinely revealing. Beckett made a sound in the back of his throat. Not quite a laugh, not quite a dismissal, something in between, and looked away. Neither of them said a word in response. Not a question about where he served, not an acknowledgement, not anything. Jerome looked at both of them and then looked back at the road. He had survived Fallujah. He had survived the Korengal Valley. He was standing on the shoulder of Riverside Corridor 4 blocks from his own house with a valid bank receipt and a contractor to call before 6. And 2 officers of the Decatur County Police Department had just responded to his military service with a sound and a look away. He said nothing. He stood where he was and waited, because he knew. With the same cold, patient certainty that had carried him through things these 2 men could not imagine. That this was not over yet, but that when it was, the record would show exactly what had happened here. Jerome had stopped explaining himself. There was nothing left to explain, and he knew it. He had produced the receipt, given his address, answered every question put to him, named his contractor, described the transaction in full, and mentioned his military service, and all of it had been received by 2 men who had made their decision before they ever stepped out of that patrol car and were simply waiting for the stop to run its course on their terms. He stood on the shoulder of Riverside Corridor with his arms at his sides and his eyes forward and said nothing, because he had reached the place that men reach after genuine difficulty. The place where you stop spending energy on things that are not going to move and start conserving it for what comes next. It was Casper who decided to run everything again. He didn't announce it. He didn't explain his reasoning. He simply told Jerome to stay where he was, walked back to the patrol car, and pulled up the full system check. Plates, license, full legal name, service record, everything the database held. The first time they had run it, early in the stop, Beckett had done it quickly and without care, the way men perform formalities when they consider the outcome already settled. He had skimmed the top of the results and moved on. Casper was different this time. He sat in the passenger's seat and read everything, all of it, from the beginning. The silence that followed lasted nearly a full minute. Jerome stood on the roadside and heard nothing from the patrol car. No voices, no radio chatter, no movement. Just the particular quality of silence that falls when people are reading something that is quietly, irreversibly dismantling what they thought they knew. He didn't turn around to look at them. He had known what was in that database since the moment he gave them his name. He had simply been waiting for them to find it. Casper got out of the car first. Everything about him had changed. The loose, easy authority he had carried through the entire stop, the posture of a man who believed the situation was entirely under his control, was gone. Not replaced by anything dramatic, just gone, the way confidence leaves a person when the ground shifts and they haven't caught up yet. He walked back toward Jerome and stopped a few feet away, and for the first time since the stop began, he didn't say anything immediately. He looked at Jerome the way people look at someone when they have just understood, too late, that they have badly and completely misjudged who they were dealing with. Beckett came up beside him a moment later with the printed results in his hand. He looked at the paper, then at Jerome, then back at the paper. The same slow, involuntary recalibration happening behind his eyes that had already happened behind Casper's. The same ground shifting under the same certainty that had never once been seriously challenged until this moment on the shoulder of Riverside Corridor on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Jerome Calloway, United States Marine Corps, 2 combat tours, Iraq and Afghanistan, honorable discharge, commendation for valor in the field, formally signed by his commanding general and entered into his permanent service record. A military history that did not fit on a single page and read like the biography of a man who had made consequential decisions under impossible conditions and been formally recognized for it by the most powerful military institution on earth. Jerome turned and looked at both of them. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't step toward them. He looked at them with the steady, unblinking expression of a man who was done being patient and was now simply making sure he remembered everything he was seeing. Across the road beside his pickup truck outside the hardware store, Weston Briggs lowered his phone slightly, not to stop recording, just to steady his grip. He had started filming 23 minutes ago. The footage was clear, well lit by the flat afternoon light of Riverside Corridor, and long enough to have captured everything. The search, the phone calls, the dismissive sound Beckett made when Jerome mentioned his service, and now the silence of 2 officers standing in front of a decorated combat veteran with the printed proof of their mistake in one hand and absolutely nothing left to say. Beckett opened his mouth. Jerome stopped him. He said quietly and without a single degree of anger in his voice, "I think we're done here." He took the bank envelope from Beckett's hand, put it back in his jacket pocket, zipped it closed, and reached for his helmet. Neither officer said a word. There was nothing left to say. Jerome took 3 days before he went to the police station, not because he was uncertain about what he wanted to do, but because he wanted everything in order before he did it. He called his attorney the evening of the stop and laid out every detail in the calm, sequential way that military training produces in people who have learned that the difference between a good outcome and a poor one often comes down to how well you prepared before you walked into the room. He gave his attorney the timeline, the names, the location, the duration, the questions that had been asked, and the answers that had been given. And the moment Beckett had looked at the printed results and stood in silence on the shoulder of Riverside Corridor with nothing left to say, his attorney told him not to make any public statements yet. Jerome agreed, went home, sat down at the kitchen table, and told Vivian everything. Vivian Calloway listened without interrupting. She had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who process things deeply before they respond, and she sat across from Jerome and let him finish completely before she said anything at all. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked one question. She asked if Weston had the footage. Jerome said yes. Vivian nodded and said, "Then we have everything we need." She was right. On Friday morning, Jerome walked into the Decatur County Police Department and filed a formal complaint for unlawful search, racial profiling, and assault. He arrived without an appointment, dressed neatly, and sat across from the desk sergeant with the same level composure he had brought to every other part of the process. He gave his account completely and accurately and left nothing out. His attorney filed the civil lawsuit the same afternoon. By the time the department's legal team had finished reading the filing that evening, Weston's footage had already been delivered to 2 local news stations. It ran that night. By the following morning, it had been picked up by national outlets. By the end of the week, it had reached veterans organizations across the country, civil rights groups in 4 states, and several members of Congress who issued public statements before the Decatur County Police Department had managed to prepare a formal response beyond the initial written statement that used the phrase, "We take all concerns seriously," and committed to nothing. The footage was not dramatic in the way that some videos are dramatic. There was no single explosive moment. What made it difficult to watch was the steadiness of it. The long, unbroken record of 2 officers working through every available justification, finding nothing, and continuing anyway. People kept returning to the moment Beckett made that sound when Jerome mentioned his military service. That half-second of audio, that dismissive exhale that wasn't quite a laugh, became the thing that the coverage kept coming back to. It said, in under a second, everything that the stop had been about from the beginning. The department launched an internal investigation. Within 11 days, the investigation had surfaced what Jerome's attorney had already located independently, that both Beckett and Casper carried prior complaints in their files. 3 against Beckett over 4 years, 2 against Casper, all involving black men stopped in similar circumstances on similar stretches of Riverside Corridor and the surrounding roads of Decatur County. Every complaint had been reviewed internally. Every complaint had been closed without action. No disciplinary measures had been taken against either officer following any of the 5 complaints. The department's official statement described this as a failure of oversight. Jerome's attorney described it in court as a pattern of conduct, and the distinction between those 2 descriptions became one of the central arguments of the civil proceedings. Beckett and Casper were terminated within the month. The city entered settlement negotiations shortly after and reached an agreement with Jerome and Vivian Calloway after 8 months of proceedings for $3.2 million. The mayor held a press conference. The police chief announced mandatory retraining. Jerome attended neither. On the Monday after the settlement was announced, Weston Briggs arrived at the house on Dunbar Crescent at 8 in the morning with his crew and began the kitchen renovation Jerome had hired him for months ago. Jerome made coffee, handed Weston a mug, and they got to work. The house that Jerome Calloway had built with his own hands was still standing. The men who had tried to take something from him on the shoulder of Riverside Corridor were not. If this story hit you the way it should, share it right now. Not just for Jerome, but for every veteran, every working man, every person who has ever been stopped, searched, and disrespected simply for existing. They serve this country, and this country owes them better. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe to JPTV. Because we will keep telling these stories until the right people are held accountable.
Human history is permanently written in the detailed records we leave behind, and each record tells a profound story of its own. Uncovering the objective truth within them is a deeply shared responsibility. Thank you for being an essential part of this meaningful exploration.